going force. So we can understand that Mahapatra's visionary world as constructed in his poetry is, you know, it is, uh, it is full of metaphors and symbols. And he is absolutely free from imitation, from borrowing, from derivativeness and all that. Because his poetic canvas is broader than any of the contemporaries of his contemporaries. You know, when you examine the poems of A.K. Ramanujan or Kamala Das or Missy Missiki, we understand that Mahapatra's poetic canvas is much broader than any of these people because he is the poet of the town and the village, and he makes his very choice very clear, right? You know, his solace, the forest, the tang of the seashore, all that is preferred to the mechanical and the automated noise of the big cities, and it is away from the noise and with the continuity of an ancestral tradition that he tries to exhibit his poetry. Because for Jayanta Mahapatra, the ancient gods are still a living presence whose spirits can be encountered when you drift through the bustling, twisting, narrow bazaars. Now, if we take a bird's eye view of the title of his volumes of poems, we can easily understand the theme and matter of his poetry. Because most of his poems imply the tragic vision of life, and that is what to which he is predominantly and essentially committed. His poems connote bleak, barren, silence, frustration, ideologies. He speaks about loneliness. And as I told you, just look at the name of his poems. Like, you have one called "Close the Sky," 10 by 10, Waiting, The Fall Stars, Start, Shadow Space, Bare Face. These are all perfect examples because they are all connotations of barrenness, silence, frustration, etc. So Mahapatra can be called a fine master craftsman who's got a superb control over his medium in a fair response to his poetry. So his sensibility is not just Indian, it's also very modern, but his response to the Indian scene is very authentic and very credible. And he is one poet who has won several laurels and distinguished awards in and outside the country. So, he has won the Jacob Glanstein Memorial Award for Poetry, the Poetry Award, which was the Sahitya Academy Award, which is given by the National Academy of Letters in New Delhi. Then he won the first prize Scottish International Open Poetry Competition in 1990. He won the Padma Shri Award, right? These are some of the honors that he has received. When you look at the themes of his poems, you can say that he's a personal poet, obsessed with hunger, poverty, loneliness, and the search for roots and self. He's from Orissa, so his attitude to Orissa, or the place to which he belongs, is a matter of deep concern. Today it's Odisha, it's Odisha. It's rightly pointed out that Mahapatra's poetry is redolent of the Odisha scene, and the titles of his poems demonstrate the unmistakable hallmark of Odisha. When you look at a few poems that he has written in the volumes that have been published, one is Dawn at Puri. Puri is in Odisha, right? Then you have another poem titled Bhubaneswar. Then you have another poem titled Odisha. Here in Orissa, Main Temple Street. Rains in Orissa. In an Orissa village, living in Orissa, deaths in Orissa, the chariot festival at Puri. See, all these titles are definitely linked to the state to which he belongs, right? And so, you can always say that his poetry is something that totally absorbs the Orissa scene or the Odisha scene, right? Now, a characteristic trait of Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry is a depiction of India and the Hindu religion with its various rituals and myths. So what he tries to do is, he has tried to explore the linguistic multiplicity, the cultural diversity of India, and that has actually contributed to his identity. But in reality, These forces uh, remain quite committed to defining and authenticating a distinctive identity. Because Mahapatra is basically a Christian and he lives in a Hindu society, and it's a society which pays maximum homage to Lord Jagannath, the Sun Temple, right? The presiding deity of Odisha. And Mahapatra's grandfather had accepted Christianity out of compelling forces of famine and poverty. That's what critics say. But there is always a sense of insecurity and alienation that we see in his poetry, right? So he perpetuates his quest for identity, and he is very keen on the assertion of his self. It emanates from a veritable part of his holy land and from its rich socio-religious traditions. So Odisha and the culture of Odisha is definitely a part of him. And so, there's some kind of alienation that he finds when he is not able to identify with the cultural identity of the state. Now, the poem that has been prescribed to you is titled Freedom. Now, freedom, the poem Freedom portrays the Indian belief system about death as freedom from the body. So, freedom is the light motif of this poem, the recurring image in this poem. This poem, Freedom, is written in the first person, and it is written from the first person's point of view. There are 12 stanzas. There's no definite structure for this poem. It may be, you can say it resembles the author's mind, the trouble in his mind, because, he says, I still cannot find freedom after 50 years of Indian independence, right? So when you look at this poem, you understand that there are many themes like freedom, death, patriotism. This poem actually talks about how India is still very dependent on the rulers even after Indian independence. So there are several symbols of politics and religion touched upon to show that the poet is referring to India. Now I'll just read the poem for you, 12 stanzas, very small poem. One stanza is maybe 3 lines, that's all. You can just listen to the poem. At times I watch, it seems as though my country's body floats down somewhere on the river. Left alone, I grow into a half disembodied bamboo, its lower part sunk into itself on the bank. Here old widows and dying men cherish their freedom, bowing time after time in obstinate prayers, while children scream with this desire for freedom to transform the world without even laying hands on it. In my blindness, at times I fear I'd wander back to either of them. In order for me not to lose a face, it is necessary for me to be alone, not to meet the woman and her child in that remote village in the hills who never had even a little rice for their one daily meal these 50 years, and not to see the uncaught, bloodied light of sunsets cling to the tall white columns of the Parliament House. In the new temple man has built nearby, the priest is one who knows freedom, while God hides in the dark like an alien. And each day I keep looking for the light, shadows find excuses to keep, trying to find the only freedom I know, the freedom of the body when it is alone, the freedom of the silent shale, the moonless coal, the beds of streams of the sleeping God. I keep the ashes away, try not to wear them on my forehead. So that's a poem. It's a very small poem. There are 12 stanzas, but each stanza is very small. Look at the first stanza. At times as I watch, it seems as though my country's body floats down somewhere on the river. So the poem begins with the words, at times as I watch, meaning that whenever the poet watches his country, which is free now from the British, it seems to him as if the country's body is floating down somewhere on the river. So now this floating body is it symbolizes the Hindu tradition in which a body is cremated and its ash is left to float in the river, right? So here the lines mean that though the country is free, yet her original condition is very different. So what has happened? The country is independent, but the situation is still the same. It's as though the country has been burned down by the people and its ashes are left to float in the river. That means the country is left in ruins. Now he goes on to say, left alone, I grow into a half disembodied bamboo, its lower part sunk into itself on the bank. So he feels, he's very helpless. He feels as though he's left alone like a half disembodied bamboo whose lower part has sunk into the river because of its own weight. Now, here the poet assumes that he is a country himself and it's dying because the own people are destroying it. Now, what has happened to the bamboo? The bamboo is sunk into the river by its own weight. Here, the country is being destroyed. The country is dying because the own people are destroying it. The people who have made it sink into the water are nobody else but the politicians and the godmen who rule the country now. Here old widows and dying men cherish their freedom, bowing time after time in obstinate prayers. Now he says, the word obstinate prayers. Prayers are not obstinate, right? It's a transferred epithet, right? Prayers are not obstinate, right? What is happening? The people are obstinate. They're stubbornly keeping on praying. But what is happening? Nobody's listening to their prayers. So he says, the old widows and the dying men, they pray to get freedom from life, from this kind of life, And you can understand the pain of these people. These people are abandoned. The people who are sent to old age homes. The people who are kept near a river by their children to die in their final stage, So what is happening? They have no hope left. And they keep on praying to God with a dedication to take out their soul from their body. So they keep on praying. They're trying to pray for freedom from this life. They want to leave this world. That is what has happened to them. While children scream with this desire for freedom to transform the world without even laying hands on it, right? So he says there's this concept of utopia, and he cannot even subscribe to that concept because he talks about the condition of the old people living in India. And then he says, it's a pathetic condition. There's nobody to look after these old people. Many of them live near the river because their children have left them there. They want them to die. Final stage, or some of them, they're abandoned. They're sent to old age homes. Some of them are living on the streets. So after having talked about this pathetic condition of the old people, he comes to the young generation and he says there's a concept of utopia. And he says, the children, they scream with this desire for freedom to transform the world without even laying hands on it. So what it means here is the aspirations of the young people are very different from the old people, right? The old people want to leave the world. What is happening to the young people? The young generation is crying so that they may be able to change their world. The old people are crying because they want to leave the world. The young generation is crying because they want to transform the world. So, this line actually shows, the kind of slavery which is even in our society today. We call ourselves independent, but all of us are trapped. We're all trapped within certain chains. So, this line, these lines actually give us a kind of insight into the economic and social condition of India, which hinders young generations to think and act freely. So they have this concept of utopia, but they don't have the facilities. They don't have the resources to transform the country. And ultimately, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be in the same boat. Just like the old people, they're also going to be in the same boat. Now he comes back into the fifth stanza. He says, in my blindness at times, I fear I'd wander back to either of them. In order for me not to lose face, it is necessary for me to be alone. So he says, the poet, he wants to wander back to, he desires to wander back to either of them. That is, the old and the young, so that he can help them. And he says, not lose face. He says, it's in actual simple words, it can be, he doesn't want to feel embarrassed celebrating freedom. He says, it is so embarrassing. We are free for so many years. We call ourselves independent, but what's happening to us? Our old people are suffering, the young people are suffering, and it is so embarrassing, He says, I wish to go and help them. So he says, for that, I need to be alone. That means he wants to be free because now he is he says he's busy. He has to work. So he cannot meet these people, right? He says, I need to meet the young as well as the old people, but I'm not able to meet them because I am so occupied or preoccupied in doing my own daily work and I'm not able to meet them. So I need to be alone. I need to be free. It is necessary for me to be alone, right? So this actually depicts the helplessness of the people who have a desire to help others, but because of their own economic conditions, they're not able to. See, there are people who really want to help out. what happens then? They are so busy earning their own livelihood. They don't have strong economic conditions, and as a result of that, they are not able to help others. Now he goes to the next stanza, not to meet the woman and the child in that remote village in the hills, who never had even a little rice for their one daily meal these 50 years. So he says, he says, my economic conditions. So he says, not to me. That means his economic conditions and his slavery to the work for earning, he has to earn, it stops him from meeting that woman and child in the remote village in the hills who never had even a little rice for their one daily meal these 50 years. So these lines are very, very symbolic because they refer to the generations of people who are economically poor, and their condition has not improved even after India has become independent. Because people do not even have one meal a day. So he says, we live in a country where these people, the woman and the child in the remote village, they don't even have one meal a day. So how can we say we are independent? How can we celebrate our freedom? And not to see the uncaught, bloody light of sunsets cling to the tall white columns of the Parliament House. He says, we are living in very bad social and economic conditions, right? So he says, people are ignorant of what's happening in the Parliament. These lines actually show the poet's concern over the politics of India, right? See, after independence, our country was supposed to be a democratic country of the people, by the people, for the people, right? But what is happening? Even so many years have passed. Now it's almost 70. When he wrote the poem, it was 50 years, but now it's almost 73 years since we've become free. And what has happened after these 73 years? We don't even know what's going on in the parliament. Right? The politicians who are ruling the country are using the money or the taxpayers' money or the resources of the country for their own luxury, for their own lives. They are becoming, they are having huge houses, they are having very luxurious cars, they are living luxurious lives. And what is happening to the poor man? You see the kind of audacity that the politicians display when they spend money to build huge buildings and erect huge statues when so many people in our country are starving. People do not even have one square meal a day, right? So what is happening? Politicians are living a very luxurious life, and the poor, on the other hand, struggling for their life. The middle class struggling to make both ends meet. So people do not even have time to look beyond their own daily struggle. And this is what makes the politicians do whatever they want. So what kind of freedom are we speaking about? You see, our own state, so much of money is being wasted. The Palarivattam bridge is, it is an eye-opener. It should be an eye-opener. It is a stark reality of how the funds have been misappropriated. How much of money has been wasted? Crores of money. Crores of rupees have been wasted. And what are these people doing? And what are we doing? We are allowing these people to rule our country again and again, rule our state again and again. And this is what they are doing. So he says, how can we call ourselves free? Then he says, in the new temple man is built nearby, the priest is the one who knows freedom, while God hides in the dark like an alien. So he says, now he comes from politicians, he moves to the religious condition of the country. Now he says, religious institutions are no better than politics. Every day there are new temples or new kind of worship places coming up. And here he says, in these worship houses, God hides in the dark like an alien, and it is a priest who only knows freedom. Now, these lines tell us the reality of our religious places. The priests who are supposed to be the servants of God are the one who enjoy the freedom and all kinds of luxury. We see so many God men and God women, right? God, who is supposed to be free, remains enslaved to the darkness of the temple like an alien. Right? The movie that was released, PK, it speaks about that, The man says, we need to protect our God. Who are we to protect gods? He's a creator, but today, we have so many godmen and so many religions who are trying to protect their gods. And in the race to protect their gods, they're killing others. So this is what happens in our own country, right? So the religious leaders have made all these temples and whatever it is, churches and all these kind of buildings as business hubs. People struggle to find God. People struggle to pray to God. And it is a priest or it is whoever the kind of pujari who extorts the money. You have so many godmen, right? Extracting and extorting money from these poor people living luxurious lives, right? And it is the priest who decides the availability of God rather than God himself. So he says, where is the freedom? We talk about so many years of freedom. Are we actually free? And each day I keep looking for the light, shadows, find excuses to keep, right? So he says, there's no freedom. And I'm looking for light shadows. It's a kind of oxymoron, right? Light shadows. It's an oxymoron. That means little hopes of freedom, which is the freedom of the body from all kinds of social, economic, religious hurdles. And he says, this is just a hope. It's just an excuse for me to satisfy my own heart. So, what the poet means here is the freedom that he knows about is death. Death is something that gives you ultimate freedom. He says only death can give you ultimate freedom, nobody else. Even if our country is free, we are still under shackles. We are still under religious shackles, economic shackles, social shackles, political shackles. So the ultimate freedom is death. And he says, when you look at the condition of the people in our country, he feels that death is better than the life that they live. So he says, what kind of celebration of freedom do we have in our country? Trying to find the only freedom I know, the freedom of the body when it's alone, the freedom of the silent shale, the moonless cold, the beds of streams of the sleeping God, right? He says, it's just after dying, in the beginning he says the ashes floating in the water, the ashes and remains of the human beings are the only ones that enjoy freedom. So he says the freedom of the silent shale means the freedom of the silent rocks, the freedom of the freedom which is deep inside the earth, right? The freedom of the rivers, the freedom of the beds. So that's what he says, the sleeping God, right? The river is considered as a sleeping God. So the poet, he says, he says, I keep the ashes away. Try not to wear them on my forehead. So he says, I don't want to wear the ashes on the forehead because he says this could be a reference to religion. Or he could not. He says I don't want to be a priest. I don't want to have anything to do with religion. I don't want to wear ashes on the forehead, right? Or it could also refer to the ashes of the dead people because it could be he's afraid of death. So he says it's better to die, but at the same time he's afraid. So he says I don't want to wear them on my forehead, right? So he says the ultimate freedom is the freedom that you get when you die. Because otherwise, when you live in this country, you're always caught in shackles. So, Jayanta Mahapatra is actually in this poem, he is not swayed by the emotional notions of freedom and independence of his country. What is he lamenting? He's lamenting that independence has lost its luster, it's lost its sheen and sense in the present context. Freedom from hunger is a mark of real independence for a country like India. And when you look at this poem, you understand that the poem begins on a very reflective note, where the poet laments the situation prevailing in the country, right? He personifies India, right? He personifies India and he says the body of his country is floating down. What is it? Floating down somewhere on the river. The poem, though it is titled Freedom, it depicts a bleak picture of our society. He's not singing praises of the independence India has acquired. He's actually questioning the real essence of being independent. And according to him, independence is not just a status to be possessed, but it is something more meaningful where people can lead or can live a very contented life. So what Mahapatra does here is he resonates in his poem the plight of Indian women, right? So he says when poverty, deprivation, social injustice, the plight of Indian women improves, then only India will become independent in the real sense. So he says you look around and you see miserable plight. You look around, you see only miserable plight. It is so painful. And he says, it is the dull reality that we always experience. So He says, you cannot ignore the deprived people. And you cannot, he says, I cannot ignore the deprived lot. I cannot write about better things of life or celebrate independence looking at the prosperous upper strata of society. The society, the reality in society is actually a clarion call to many people. He's striving to raise his voice against the injustice prevalent in our society by depicting that in his poetry. So because Mahapatra is definitely shattered at the deteriorating and declining moral and the moral conduct of the people of India, which is actually, he says, it's a defiance to Gandhi's preaching and contemplation. When you read his typical words, that's what he says. And in many interviews he says this is actually, it's against us what Gandhiji has preached. It's a defiance against Gandhiji. So in this poem, Freedom, Mahapatra is in a very reflective mood, and he highlights the stark realities existing in spite of India proclaiming its independent status. So he throws light on the disparity, and he shows the paradoxical state of existence. So we can understand that when you read the poem, what you understood is Mahapatra presents the pain, the guilt, the remorse, the hunger, the desire, the moments of renewal. And this environment is filled with symbols of belief by the ordinary lives of people of Cuttack in Odisha, the temples, the Hindu festivals, the ancient monuments, and so on. So the process of freedom is a complex construct for Mahapatra. Because freedom does not stand for freedom alone. Freedom coincides with the consciousness of the rich past heritage. So freedom does not hold any meaning without this aesthetic realization. Freedom for Mahapatra is a freedom to reconstruct the golden glory of both the past and the present in which the future of India lies. So in the title, you can find a touch of irony, because we understand that Mahapatra is ridiculing the independent status of the country, which according to him is a farce. It's not in practice, and it is unreal like a shadow without life. So his poetry is actually a reminder about the values and the identity of our nation. So he is indirectly digging at the, it's digging at the people. I mean, at the nation, there's an indirect dig, and his concern for human misery shows his social and moral responsibility. You know, so he has engaged a lot of words, right? So engagement with words should not banish sympathies, right? So Mahapatra intends to advance that both poetry and the poet must be steeped in human sympathies. So that is why he's trying to establish a bond between the poet, the poetry, and the terrifying face of the real world. So because unless you have this link, poetry is likely to remain a pretext of unconcern. So what he's trying to do is, he is trying to show how his poetry stems from human concern, and that is what he wants to do, and that is why he wants to be alone. So Mahapatra's poetry is poetry of exploration, where the need for survival with dignity in the midst of all this corruption and decay seems to be the basic preoccupation. So his poem Freedom can be called a depiction of the societal situation. The irony of independence and the paradoxical state is very well captured by the poet. So that is what this poem is all about. So he is trying to show us the irony. India is independent, but it's a paradox. It's an irony, because even though it is supposed to be independent, what is the actual freedom that we enjoy? Do we really enjoy any freedom at all? That is what he's trying to explain here. Okay, so that is a poem for you. Thank you very much.